Muy buenas noches. Vamos a dar inicio al segundo taller de investigación aplicada de la gestión 2021. Bienvenidos a este día de la Fundación ARU junto al Instituto de Investigaciones Socio-Económicas de la Universidad Católica Boliviana ISEC. En esta ocasión presentamos la investigación Pobreza multidimensional en el contexto rural, un análisis en el Altiplano Sur de Oruro, y en inglés, Multidimensional Poverty in the Rural Context, an Analysis in the Southern Andean Highlands of Oruro, de los autores Sergio Garbay y Lucila Aguilar. Antes de empezar con el programa, anunciamos que este taller tendrá intervenciones en español e inglés. También, para mejorar la calidad de nuestros talleres, pedimos por favor a los participantes de la reunión de Zoom que al finalizar el evento puedan apoyarnos respondiendo una encuesta sobre el desenvolvimiento de este taller. Muchas gracias. Para iniciar este taller, por favor, pedimos a todos los participantes que mantengan sus micrófonos apagados para no intervenir en las presentaciones. Como primer punto del programa, invitamos al director ejecutivo de la Fundación ARU, Álvaro Chirino, quien dará las palabras de bienvenida. Adelante, por favor. Mil disculpas, estamos teniendo unos problemas de conexión con nuestro director. Ahora sí creo que ya está, ¿o todavía?
Sí, buenas noches a todos, ¿sí? ¿Me escuchan?
Sí, se escucha.
Ya, gracias, Tony. Sí, justo tuve un problema con el Zoom ahora. Bueno, buenas noches a todos los presentes, en especial a los investigadores que van a presentar su trabajo el día de hoy, a Lucila y a Sergio. Agradecer también la presencia de Celia Reyes, que es filipino de estudios sobre el desarrollo y es líder de la red del sistema de monitoreo basado en la comunidad. A Fernanda Vanderlei, directora del ISEC, a Milenka Figueroa, investigadora del Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo PNUD, a Wilson Jiménez, director de investigación en Fundación ARU, y a todos los asistentes presentes. Comentar brevemente sobre la experiencia de ARU en el tema que vincula al taller del día de hoy. El estudio de la pobreza multidimensional en Bolivia, ya desde el 2013, en un documento que usaba la serie de encuestas a hogares. Para el 2014 se ha realizado un documento de pobreza para el municipio de Concepción en Valle Grande. En 2018 se realizó un documento junto con Swiss Contact para estimar la pobreza multidimensional en unidades productivas agropecuarias del país. Y más recientemente, en el 2019, se realizó un estudio a nivel municipal en todo el departamento de Tarija para igual estimar la pobreza multidimensional. Mencionar que los últimos trabajos han estado muy vinculados con todo el proceso en la construcción de un índice de pobreza multidimensional, desde la definición de las dimensiones, los indicadores, las ponderaciones, y finalmente el análisis de estos resultados. No se ha limitado a estudiar necesariamente información secundaria, sino que se han vinculado todo el proceso que conlleva hacer un IPM, justamente respaldados en mucha de la literatura reciente. Con esos antecedentes, bueno, quiero invitarlos a escuchar a los investigadores del taller de hoy y ojalá este estudio pueda contribuir a investigaciones posteriores. Muchas gracias.
Agradecemos las palabras del director ejecutivo de la Fundación ARU, Álvaro Chirino. Seguidamente, presentamos la investigación Pobreza multidimensional en el contexto rural, un análisis en el Altiplano Sur de Oruro, y en inglés, Multidimensional Poverty in the Rural Context, and Analysis in the Southern Andean Highlands of Oruro, de los autores Sergio Garbay y Lucila Aguilar. Sergio Garbay es licenciado en Economía de la Universidad Católica Boliviana San Pablo. Fue beneficiario de la beca Bachiller de Excelencia que otorga la Universidad Católica Boliviana, la cual le cubrió el 100% de sus estudios universitarios. Trabajó como asistente de investigación en ISEC por 3 años. Es parte de Fundación ARU ya por 2 años y actualmente desempeña el cargo de investigador. Luciana Aguilar es licenciada en Economía y egresada de la carrera de Estadística, ambas carreras de la Universidad Mayor de San Andrés. Actualmente desempeña funciones como investigadora en la Fundación ARU y en la Unidad de Microdatos y Encuestas. Antes que comience la exposición, recordar que todos los participantes de la reunión de Zoom y del Facebook Live pueden ir dejando sus comentarios y al final de la participación de la comentarista se abrirá un espacio para que los autores puedan responderlas. Sin más, damos la bienvenida a Sergio Garbay y Lucila Aguilar, quienes realizarán su exposición en inglés. Adelante, por favor.
Thank you, Stephanie. First of all, good evening to all the authorities present, to ISEC's Director, Fernanda Vanderlei, to ARU Foundation Director, Álvaro Chirino, to Dr. Celia Reyes, to Wilson Jimenez, and all my dear work teammates, colleagues, and all the assistants. Thank you for being present and listen to this workshop. I will share my screen now. Can you confirm that it's visible to the audience, please?
Sí, Sergio, se ve.
Great, thank you. So let's start the presentation. My name is Sergio Andrés Garbay Flores. I am a researcher at ARU Foundation. And in this opportunity, together with my co-worker and co-author Lucila Aguilar, we will present this working paper, which is under the ARU working paper series for this year. And it has its starting point in a project between ARU Foundation and United Nations Development Program for Bolivia. The title of the paper is Multidimensional Poverty in the Rural Context, an Analysis in the Southern Andean Highlands of Oruro. This will be the presentation's content, and we will start with a motivation. The well-known economist Amartya Sen, who also develops the main ideas behind a multidimensional approach, disputes that poverty represents the main source of unfreedom. He argues that capacities determine the level of life. That means that poverty does not imply only a low accumulation of private goods that can be sold or accumulated by one person. The concept is more linked to the lack of possibilities that a person has to satisfy his basic needs. So this conception of poverty understands it as linked to the deprivation of abilities, the denial of rights that could allow living in a way considered decent. Consequently, the conceptual understanding of poverty has been enhanced and deepened considerably in the last decades, as it is reflected in the SDGs agenda, which seeks to reduce poverty in all its forms and also reduce poor exposure and vulnerability by fostering its resilience. Also, a high proportion of poor people usually live in rural areas. According to the latest data from the census from 2012, the poverty levels in Oruro's rural areas is high. In the southern Altiplano of Oruro, more than 80% of people is poor. Now, there is a wide consensus that poverty is a multidimensional phenomenon, and its analysis and measurement should not be based solely on income, as it is unable to capture other key poverty dimensions, such as food insecurity, lack of education, unemployment, inadequate housing, poor sanitation, lack of healthcare, and other deprivations that people could face or experience. So the rely on a unidimensional approach could mean risk leaving people behind. And also a key point of our investigation is that often poverty measures do not differentiate between urban and rural settings. They treat them as a whole or as equal. They don't analyze the livelihoods and vulnerabilities to shocks the last group experience, nor consider the diverse surrounding in rural areas. Well, so some background for our measurement. As I mentioned before, this paper uses information from a project where UNDP is the main promoter. The project is called Strengthening the Resilience of the Southern Highlands, its main objective is to formulate solution packages with a multidimensional approach that promote the relationship between environmental functions, sustainable production systems, and poverty reduction to foster territorial resilience. And also, the project in its initial phase has the objective to provide information to the municipalities so that this can serve as a diagnosis. This will respond to the need for information at local levels, where in rural municipalities or communities is especially scarce, because the latest information available comes from the census, which is carried out every 10 years or more. So there is no up-to-date information. The latest census was carried out in 2012. So the project seeks to take advantage of the autonomic competences that are still on, so that they can use the information more efficiently. So in order to supply this need for information, ARU Foundation and UNDP reached an agreement to promote the Informed Communities Initiative called Community E, which aims to serve or provide to local authorities a tool for monitoring all public policies. So a brief review of literature. Sen noted in his influential article from 1976 that measurement of poverty entails mainly two distinct problems. The first one is the identification of the poor among the reference population, and the second one is the aggregation of the information of the poor into an overall index of poverty. This two-step method has become the standard conceptual framework for poverty measurement, and this also applies for multidimensional approaches. And since the paradigm changed in the recent years from a unidimensional to a multidimensional framework, various approaches have been put forward in the literature to measure poverty in a multidimensional settings. We have, for example, Claassen, Burguignon-Chakrabarty, and also Aguilar and Foster. This last method, the Aguilar and Foster, AF from now on, is based in the poverty ideas by Sen, and also has a widespread acceptance and is used, for example, in the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index by UFI and UNDP. Now, in terms of rural settings, rural people are more prone to experience a more chronic or persistent poverty, mostly because they are more exposed to risk and they are less able to deal with it. And also the range and determinants of context presented in the region puts barriers in the pursuit of greater well-being. Echeverria, for example, identifies three problems in Latin America that rural populations suffer. The first one is insufficient security. The second one is few or mostly zero opportunities in agricultural activities, which is their main income, and also in other non-agricultural activities. And the third one is a low interest in promoting effectively the interests of rural populations. Now, how about the developments of a multidimensional frameworks in a rural setting? Well, in the literature, we can identify mainly two approaches. The first one is the Multidimensional Poverty Assessment Tool, MPIT, developed by IFAD. MPIT is a survey-based thematic indicator, which his main purpose is to give information and also to assist in designing and give prioritization efforts at a local level. So it provides a clear understanding of rural poverty by focusing on key aspects and domains that this population could experience. And also the second one, we have an MPI proposed by OFI and UNDP, which recognizes that the livelihoods urban and rural people face are different in resources, exposure to risk, and surrounding settings. However, this method, contrary to the MPIT, is still in development. It has not yet been tested and not applied in different rural contexts. Now, in terms of works, empirical works in Bolivia, there has been a few empirical studies in the recent years. The first one is by Villarroel and Hernán Marino, who use AF and Coneval approach with weights. So they identified monetary dimensions and also social dimensions. The second one is Portugal and Vera, who follow the standard AF approach method with weights and Coneval method with deprivation indicators. So they classify the dimensions and indicators in personal and environmental set of indicators. Next, we have the work by Hernani Marino and Tito, who proposed a multidimensional poverty assessment using CBMS data in a community e-case study. Next, we have the study by Celia, who uses the SIDA approach to identify the dimensions, and they use the AF method to aggregate the information. Next, recently, Andersen and Branisa follow also the SIDA approach, but they do this at a municipal level, and they use the census data for 2012 to analyze poverty. And finally, we have the experience from Tarija, who developed a local MPI following the AF approach, and also used a primary source for information for constructing their MPI. So in Bolivia, most of the approaches rely on secondary information, contrary to the proposal presented in this paper. Now, in terms of the data comes from the survey developed at household and municipal communal level, which is called Informed Communities under the name of UNDP Multidimensional Solution Packages Program. This survey was adapted to the project objective and validated by UNDP and Oruro government, and holds the information to construct the thematic indicators translated into questions to collect the needed information to construct the MPI. So this survey was carried out in the southern highland region of Oruro, which is a department in Bolivia, and it has information of 4 municipalities: Carangas, Yunguyo del Litoral, Esmeralda, and Coipasa, and 1 indigenous government, which in Spanish stands for Autonomía Indígena Originaria Campesina, AIOC, which is Uruchipaya. So in coordination with local authorities, the information collected has a quantitative information that comes from a right census, that is the data collected from people according to their usual place of residence. And it also has a qualitative information from interviews that comes from with mayors and other local authorities. So as a result of this thematic survey, a multidimensional poverty measure with focus on rural settings is constructed. In this paper, we use the AF methodology. With this method, we will identify the multidimensional poor households, and we will be able to identify the denial of rights in this region. As I mentioned before, the AF uses a double cutoff approach for identifying the poor that extends the classical or traditional union and intersectional approaches. The AF approach certainly offers the advantage of being very simple, clear, and extremely appealing. And moreover, the method is also a flexible tool in its implementation because it allows incorporating different dimensions that can guide and reflect objectives of public policy aimed at reducing and elevation of poverty. So the central framework under which the joint distribution of deprivations is studied is through an achievement matrix, which in the image is X. This matrix contains the households in each row and the dimensions in each column. That resumes the performance of the households in each dimension. One key point that it's worth mentioning is that we use household as our unit of identification in our MPI. Next, to define the dimensions and indicators we use in our MPI, we use the Mpit Framework in its 7th version. This framework captures information of domains fundamental to human well-being and poverty elevation in a rural setting, and is designed to be universal enough to be relevant to most rural contexts around the world. So, and it's also a very flexible tool that can be used in many ways to support the rural development. This MPI comprises 11 dimensions, 35 subdimensions, and 112 indicators. The first 6 dimensions correspond to fundamental needs. There is a wealth of evidence that links these 6 components and the synergies involved to poverty and poverty elevations in almost all contexts. The first one is nutrition and food security. This dimension, evaluates the access to food in the home. The second one is domestic water supplies. It evaluates the access and quality of water access in the house. The third one is health and healthcare, which measures people's health status and also healthcare quality and access. Next, we have sanitation and aging. which measures the quality of household sanitation, food waste management, and personal hygiene. Next, housing, clothing, and energy measures the overall quality of the home's main construction, the ability to appropriate clothing, and the quality of the energy used, especially for cooking. And finally, we have education, which measures the quality of children's formal education and if they have access to it. The remaining 5 dimensions correspond to a new rurality, according to the authors, in which many rural poor people now live. The first one of these 5 dimensions is farm assets, which measures the general capacity of the household to produce food and income. Next, we have non-farm assets, which measures the household's non-farm income generating capacity, access to credit, and also the household's wealth. Next, we have exposure and resilience to shocks, which measures the household exposure to natural and socio-economic shocks and its ability to cope from these shocks. Next, we have gender and social equality, which evaluates equal access to food, education, and healthcare for children, adults, and women. And also, it evaluates the social degree equality in the municipality, community, or IOC. And finally, we have climate change adaptations, which evaluates the amount of agricultural practices implemented by households and also the sources of water for agricultural activities, human capacity, and the resilience of municipalities, communities, or AOC infrastructure. So now, let's dive into the methodology of AF framework. This is a double cutoff approach. In the first cutoff, for each indicator J, a threshold Z is set as a minimum achievement required for a household to be considered without deprivation. This threshold is called the deprivation cutoff point. So each household achievement level in a given indicator, if it falls below this threshold, it will have a deprivation in that indicator. So in this way, we obtain the deprivation matrix called G. Then a weight is assigned to each dimension, an indicator. In this MPI, we give the same importance to each dimension. However, the weights of the subdimensions and indicators within each dimension are not equal. They differ according to the MPI's approach, and we follow that framework. We multiply these two components and we obtain the deprivation score, C, which reflects the deprivation gap of each household across all indicators. So the more deprivation the household has, the score will be higher. Next, the AF methodology uses a second cutoff point called the poverty threshold and is denoted by K. This threshold is the minimum deprivation score that a household needs to experience in order to be considered multidimensional poor. If the household is poor, the identification function P, in this case, will take the value of 1. As we see here, if the score is higher than K, it will take a value of 1. So for this MPI, we use a value that maximizes the variation in the explanation of how much poverty exists based on certain characteristics at municipal level. We see that in the figure shown, where a geographical reference is taken, in this case, municipalities. When performing this procedure, it can be identified that the value taken by K, where the variance is at its maximum, is 33%. However, we take a conservative value with K equal to 30%. So that is our second cutoff point. The next step is to compare the deprivation score with the poverty line K that we defined earlier. With this information, a sensory deprivation matrix G is formed. When performing this operation, the deprivations of those that are not poor are sensory. That is, it takes the value of 0. And we are only interested in the information of those that are classified as poor. And they have a score of C, which is called a sensory deprivation score, which is CEK. This information is the outcome of the identification method in the AF methodology. Once the poor has been identified, the next step is at the aggregation of the information of the poor. We have two fundamental indexes in the AF methodology. H, which is the multidimensional headcount ratio or the incidence of multidimensional poverty, and A, which represents the average deprivation score across the poor or the intensity of poverty. In the methodology, these are called two partial indexes. And the product of H and A, these two terms result in the adjusted headcount index of the multidimensional poverty. This index, by its construction, can vary both by a change in a reduction in the number of poor households, H, or a reduction in the number of deprivation that poor households experience, A. So the lower this index, the poor households are experiencing an improvement in terms of opportunities in development. And we use this adjusted headcount index, M0, to estimate multidimensional poverty and also take advantages of two key properties of this measure. The first one is the population subgroup decomposability, which allows assessing the subgroup contributions to overall poverty. And the second one is the breakdown property by indicator, which makes possible to find out the contribution of each indicator, dimension or subdimension, to overall poverty. Now, for the explanation of the results and the following section, I yield the floor to my co-author, Lucila.
Good evening to everybody. So now given that the Alkir-Foster methodology and the IFADs and multidimensional poverty assessment tool has been developed, I'm going to present the results. So in order to make it a little bit organized, at first we are going to see the aggregated results, then the municipal results, and finally the analysis by the sex of the household head will be presented. So in the table, we can see that the incidence or headcount ratio denoted by age is approximately 72%, for a poverty threshold equal to 30%, which means that on average 72% of households from the territories under study have a deprivation in at least 30% of the 11 dimensions, which is 3 dimensions or more, or in terms of indicators, 72% of households experiment deprivation in at least 34 from the 112 indicators. One may be also interested in knowing how poor the poor households are. So we present the intensity of poverty denoted by A, and it reaches 36%, meaning that each of the poor households of the territories on average experience deprivations in more than 1/3 of the weighted indicators. Because the M0 measure is the product of the incidence and intensity, it takes the value of 0.26, which implies that multidimensional poor households experiment around 26% of the total deprivation of all households in the sample. We can also see in the table indexes like vulnerability and severity of the multidimensional poverty index denoted by B and S, respectively. So the first index refers to those households that are deprived in an interval lower than the established threshold, meaning households with a percentage of deprivation located between 20 and 30%. So about 27% of the households are close to the poverty threshold, in a way that the increase of even one deprivation can turn them into multidimensional poor households. Regarding the second index, severity, it can be distinguished that approximately 2% of the households have a deprivation score who is equal to or greater than 45%, meaning deprivation in 5 dimensions or more, or equivalently in 50 indicators or more. Next, please. On the other hand, and due to the additive property of the M0 measure, the index can be decomposed by dimensions, and this allows us to see the contribution that each dimension has to the multidimensional poverty measure, and the dimensions with greater contribution are adaptation to climate change, followed by the non-farm assets, farm assets, exposure and resilience to shocks, and sanitation and hygiene. On the other hand, the dimensions with lower contribution are food and nutrition security, social and gender equality, housing, clothing and energy, domestic water supply, and education. The decomposition by dimensions allows us to realize that households located in the selected territories of the southern Andean highlands of Oruro face problems in dimensions related to rural livelihoods, life, and well-being, especially in the adaptation to climate change dimension, which is the dimension with the highest contribution to the overall poverty. So, talking in terms of indicators, we can see that there's a large number of households that do not carry out more than 2 agricultural practices, have at least 3 issues with their land, have limited access to water supply to perform their agricultural activities. The access and reception of meteorological information is not diverse, and even worse, the major of the municipalities declare that they do not have natural resource management plans. Next, please. So, because it is important to know what happens in each of the selected territories, we present the results disaggregated by municipalities. And we can appreciate that the Carangas municipality has the largest multidimensional poverty rate. Around 70% of its households were identified as poor. And Esmeralda is the municipality with the lowest incidence. Only 62% of the household have a deprivation score equal to or greater than 30%. Paying attention to the intensity, it ranges 34 and 37%, being higher in the Urupaya municipality and lower in the Yunguyo del Litoral municipality. With respect to the M0 measure, the municipality of Carangas has the largest value, and Esmeralda's municipalities have the lowest value. Although from the 3 indexes, we can see that Esmeralda municipality has the lowest values in terms of vulnerability, as that is the territory with the largest percentage of vulnerable households, namely around 34% of the households are close to the poverty threshold. And in regard to severity, only 2% of the households from Carangas and Coipasa municipalities have households whose deprivation score is equal to or greater than 45%. And in the Urupaya municipality, this percentage reaches about 5%. Next, please. In the same way, we can also show the contribution that each dimension has over the municipal M0 measure. In fact, we can point out that this is dimensions with the smallest contribution can be found in education in Yunguyo del Litoral municipality, and this is due to the reduced quantity of children in school age in the households from this municipality. So we found minimal levels of deprivation in the indicators related to quality, availability, and access to education. In addition, the figures suggest that dimensions with the highest contributions are not the same across the municipalities. For instance, while in Uruchipaya and Esmeralda municipalities, the non-farm assets is the dimension with the highest contribution, in Carangas, Coipasa, and Yunguyo del Litoral municipality is the adaptation to climate change dimension, the one with the highest contribution. And even though the results were disaggregated by a municipality, we can see a common denominator, and it is that the 5 territories require strategies focused on improving household resilience, because highest contributions are observed in dimensions related to rural well-being. Next, please. Did we miss one? Okay. We know that the policies directed toward the poorest of the poor will be that will accomplish a reduction in the M0 measure. So for that reason, we made an additional analysis with respect to the intensity. As the intensity is understood as an average of the weighted deprivation of those households classified as poor, where the weights add up to 1, in order to identify which dimensions need to be addressed, a rescale of the weights was carried out so that they add up to 1 within each dimension. The analysis has been done in terms of subdimensions, but because of time, we are going to present only at a dimensional level. But we have to make it clear that this operation was made with the main goal to observe in which dimension the intensity is higher, and to make it clear that we are going to present the results in terms of percentage, meaning from 0 to 100. Minimum values, in the table we can see minimum and maximum intensities that the poor undergo, and intensities above the 80% beside the climate change adaptation, because we know that's the dimension that has the highest contribution, is the non-farm assets dimension. Particularly, we identify high values in the skill and employment subdimension, meaning that the poor households lack the potential to generate income either from small businesses and the supply of specialized services. Another dimension with high intensities, with high values, is the farm assets, mainly because the households face deprivation in the land tenure subdimension, because they do not have access to land, or in case they do have access, the area for agricultural activities is less than 0.5 hectares. Moreover, we also identify higher intensities in the exposure and resilience to shocks. Poor households identify shocks that may affect them, and they declare that the gravity and probability of occurrence are high, so they have higher intensities in the coping and recovery skills of dimension. There is also high intensities, not in dimensions related to rural livelihoods and well-being, but in dimensions related to fundamental needs, particularly in sanitation and hygiene, indicating that poor households do not have proper access to sanitation installations, or in case they do have the access, it is not continuous. Regarding the health and healthcare dimensions, we can see that Esmeralda municipality have a highest intensities. Poor households from this municipality present difficulties to access to health services. They declare that if any member get a serious disease, the household would not be in conditions to afford professional or traditional treatment. So for that reason, they tend to self-diagnose and self-treat in order to avoid travel long distances. So we can appreciate by the analysis of the intensities that poor households not only have higher intensities in dimensions related to climate, to rural livelihoods, but in fundamental needs, particularly in dimensions related to sanitation and hygiene and health and healthcare. Next, please. I'm sorry, I thought this page was before, but in the spider chart, we can see that the mean values of the previous table were plotted. So points closer to 100 implies high intensities, and points closer to the center or 0 implies low intensities. As I stated before, the dimensions related to rural livelihoods having higher intensities closer to 80%. And regarding the six first dimensions, the dimensions that have higher intensities are health and healthcare, and sanitation and hygiene. Next, please. We also present the result by the sex of household head, because we were able to capture if the household is led by men, women, or couples. And the largest incidence of poverty is when the household is led by couple. All households that are led by couple were identified as poor, and it is slightly less when the household head, when the head of the household is a man, 68%, than a woman, 75%. Regarding poverty intensity, it is observed that households with women as the head have a larger average of the weighted deprivation, 36% approximately. As a result, the M0 measure is lower when the head of the household is a man or a woman than a couple. However, when the household is led by a couple, the percentage is slightly higher, 0.36%. On the other hand, by analyzing the vulnerability to poverty, it is lower for female head households than male head households. Regarding the severity of multidimensional poverty, only the male head of household experimented deprivation equal to or greater than 45% of the weighted indicators, approximately 3% of the household. Next, please. We also present the contribution of each dimension by the sex of household head, and we can appreciate that when the household is led by women, the non-farm assets have higher contribution. When the households are led by a man or a couple, the dimension with the highest intensity is the climate change adaptation. But dimensions related to rural livelihoods are the main problem, whether the sex of the household of the head of the household. I'm sorry. Next, please. So to sum up, this work presents the results of the multidimensional poverty index in the southern Andean highlands of Oruro, with the main goal to guide the economic planning towards the dimensions that require attention the most. And to do that, we use the Alkire-Foster methodology and the IFAD's multidimensional poverty assessment tool. Because we consider that the combination of both methodologies makes a better multidimensional rural poverty approach. So we consider the 11 dimensions that the multidimensional poverty assessment tool explains, the 35 subdimensions and the 112 indicators. But to construct every single indicator, we use the deprivation methodology. Regarding the municipalities show notorious differences between one and another, but there is a common denominator, as I stated in every single page. Resources need to be focused on dimensions related to livelihoods and rural well-being, specifically in climate change adaptation. Regarding fundamental needs, sanitation and hygiene, and healthcare dimensions need to be addressed because the intensities that poor households experience are higher. Next, please. Now, we know that an integral part of the CBMS process is the community validation. For that reason, we organized a workshop that essentially involved the presentation of the results using a dashboard for intensity and incidence. At first, we let the authorities talk and express the problems that inhabitants had faced or were currently facing relating to the 11 dimensions proposed in the analysis, and then the results were presented. Finally, we received a feedback from them, and the authorities agreed with the information that was presented. Specifically, they remarked that results reflect the reality of inhabitants of the southern Andean highlands of Oruro. That's it.
Hola, perdón, ¿se me escucha? Muchas gracias a Sergio. Muchas gracias. Agradecemos a Sergio y Lucila por su presentación. A continuación tendremos los comentarios de la doctora Celia M. Reyes al documento presentado. La doctora Celia Reyes es la primera mujer presidenta del Instituto Filipino de Estudios del Desarrollo. Se especializa en el campo de la econometría y ha realizado y publicado numerosos trabajos de investigación y políticas sobre evaluaciones de la pobreza y evaluaciones de programas de protección social. También es líder de la red del sistema de monitoreo basado en la comunidad CBMS, que brinda asistencia técnica gratuita a las unidades del gobierno local en Filipinas en la implementación del CBMS. El CBMS es una herramienta local de monitoreo de la pobreza que desarrolló en el marco del proyecto Microimpactos de las Políticas de Ajuste Macroeconómico en 1993 y fue adoptado en el contexto local para la realización de varios estudios temáticos en sitios seleccionados en más de 25 países en desarrollo en Asia, África y Latinoamérica. Es graduada de la licenciatura en Ciencias en Estadística. Obtuvo su maestría en Artes en Economía de la Universidad de Filipinas y su doctorado en Filosofía en Economía de la Universidad de Pensilvania. Por favor, demos la bienvenida a la doctora Celia Reyes. Good evening and welcome, Dr. Celia Reyes. You can start with your presentation.
Thank you. Buenas noches. Good evening to our Executive Director, Alvaro Chirino, Research Director Wilson Jimenez, Executive Director Fernanda Wanderley of the Institute for Socio-Economic Research of the Catholic University, Ms. Milenka Figueroa of UNDP, and the other participants in this forum. I would also like to greet Alejandro Bricker from the CBMS Argentina research team. And I'm also joined today by my colleagues from the CBMS network, Badet Mandap and Jas Kilitis. Please allow me to thank ARU for inviting me to this forum. I'm very pleased to be here today to hear the presentation of the paper of Ms. Aguilar and Mr. Garbay on multidimensional poverty. With only 9 years away from 2030, we are finding that countries are still grappling with indicators, with the development bank, the OECD, the UNDP, particularly address these gaps. The first goal of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, is to end poverty in all its forms by 2030. To monitor progress towards the achievement of this goal requires measurement of multidimensional poverty. That's the work that has been done. It's a vital contribution. I first became acquainted with ARU in 2013 as CBMS program leader of the Partnership for Economic Policy, or PEP. We provided grants to research teams in developing countries through a competitive call for proposals to pilot test the community-based monitoring system as a tool to monitor poverty at the local level. ARU was our partner in Bolivia, and they had a very successful project. In fact, we had the opportunity to visit Concepcion, the project site, and meet with some local officials. I'm glad to see how ARU has moved that initiative further by combining it with other frameworks and tools to measure multidimensional poverty in the context of rural communities in Bolivia. Let me just mention that some of the major contributions of this study. First relates to the objectives of the research. Next slide, please. Objectives of the research, which are very relevant for policy design and implementation. The study aims to analyze how poverty manifests itself from different perspectives and should identify the structural causes of poverty. The research also aims to guide economic planning towards the dimensions that require attention the most and to be able to address the different poverty aspects that the municipalities of interest are facing. In addition, the study also showed how existing tools for multidimensional poverty assessment can be adapted to the local context. It demonstrated how the Alkire-Foster method can be applied in the local context, utilizing the multidimensional poverty assessment tool developed by I5 in the process of dimensions, in the selection of dimensions and specific indicators of poverty in the rural areas, as well as the use of the CBMS, the Comunidad E, tools for collecting data for the generation of the indicators. While other poverty studies commonly use available national survey data, utilizing different sources of data for different indicators collected at different times, or perception survey data, the study presented today utilized local level data collected using the same methodology and tool at the same point in time for the calculation of MPI and other poverty indicators. As has been mentioned by authors, this paper is the first study to evaluate and explore multidimensional poverty in Bolivia within the rural context. It has also done an extensive review of literature on the topic of multidimensional in this. It might also be good to include the CBMS composite indicator as another measure of multidimensional poverty. Now, as has been presented earlier, the study utilized three main tools for multidimensional poverty analysis. The AF method is a way of measuring dimensional poverty, and it involves counting the different types of deprivation that individuals experience at the same time, such as a lack of education, employment, and so forth. And these deprivation profiles are analyzed to identify who's poor and then used to construct a multidimensional index of poverty. Now, the Mpit, as has been explained earlier, is a method that provides measures of fundamental dimensions of rural poverty in a local context. On the other hand, the CBMS emphasizes the collection of data that you are able to collect the different dimensions simultaneously experienced by the households. So the research team was able to draw the best features of the different tools and approach to come up with an appropriate measure in the southern Andean highlands of Oruro. Now, let me just focus on the details for these different tools, just to show some of the major differences. For the Alkire-Foster approach, it looked at three major dimensions, and dimensions, adding in particular livelihoods, as well as resilience to shocks and climate change, and a few more. In the case of CBMS, you have health, you have 9 dimensions covering health, nutrition, housing, water, sanitation, education, income, employment, and security. And in the case of Bolivia, when they were doing the CBMS study, they focused on 5 basic dimensions: education, social security, housing, basic services, and income. Now, all 3 methods can be used to examine multidimensional poverty and to generate poverty indicators. The extent of their usefulness for policy design and program implementation vary, taking into account their distinct features. For instance, the AF and Mpit covers only non-income measures of poverty, while CBMS also includes both income and non-income measures of poverty. As has been mentioned earlier, the advantage of MPAT in this particular case is that it focuses on indicators of poverty in the rural setting, so more customized towards a rural setting, whereas CBMS indicators for both urban and rural areas. MPAT and CBMS methodologies both provides mechanisms and tools to collect data requirements for the generation of indicators. They both have manuals that provide guidelines in terms of how to collect the data for the proposed indicators, while the AF method is primarily a formula or a tool for putting together the different data collected from that has been collected primarily by national statistical offices, but can also be utilized to data such as the CBMS to come up with this multidimensional poverty index. So MPAT and CBMS both collects household and village level data. On the other hand, MPAT, based on the guidelines prepared by IFAD, collects data through random sampling. CBMS involves a household census. In addition, MPAT collects perception survey data, while CBMS follows a standard set of questions using official concepts and definitions being used by the National Statistics Office. So all three methods actually can provide information who the poor are, but vary in terms of the dimensions that they cover and consequently the amount of information that they can actually generate and be the basis for the policy interventions. If we go to the next slide, actually, we will see that the AF approach uses about 10 indicators. MPAT has the most extensive list at 112 indicators, while CBMS utilizes a core set of indicators numbering about 14. And while the AF MPI puts together all of the 10 indicators to come up with, this is based on the original AF formula for the SDG measure of the MPI. But as I mentioned earlier, the AF methodology or formula can actually be applied to other data sources. But originally, the idea is to put together these 10 indicators to come up with one composite index. MPAT, on the other hand, does not really propose for aggregating all of these indicators, all of these 112 indicators to come up with one indicator. CBMS, on the other hand, appreciates the value of having separate indicators for the different dimensions, primarily because this would provide the information that policymakers can use to act upon, so they can readily determine whether the deprivation is in the area of health or nutrition or housing, and therefore can use this to allocate the resources that they have, and also in terms of targeting. But at the same time, CMS also recognizes the value of having a composite index to measure the simultaneous deprivations being experienced by households. And so there is a composite index that can be generated using CBMS data. The beauty of, or the advantage of having an overall index is that you can have a tool that easily ranks countries. That was the initial use of the AF, to have this one number to show the condition of the country, but can also be used in this case for ranking the municipalities. I think this study, the main contribution of this study really is that it was able to put together these different approaches to be able to address the needs of policymakers in terms of reducing or coming up with appropriate poverty alleviation programs for the rural areas. So the ARU study was able to show how CBMS data can be used to calculate MPI using the AF method, but expanded the set of dimensions and indicators, adopting the MPAT dimensions and indicators. So it uses 112 indicators for the 11 dimensions. But I think it would also be good for the team for future studies to consider other additional dimensions or indicators to further expand the list to better capture the rural conditions. So, for instance, income could be considered, financial inclusion, such as access to mobile phones for financial transactions, given the increasing use of mobile phones. Education, in the area of education, perhaps other indicators can be considered, such as school participation or attendance of children, rather than just input indicators, can also be considered. Now, going to the next slide, what I want to point out is that I think, in addition to selecting indicators to come up with a challenge in setting up an MPI is setting the deprivation threshold, and I'm glad that the authors presented this today. For instance, the subdimension consumption under nutrition and food security is to assess whether or not most of the time the household has sufficient food amount. A household is considered deprived if some household members experience the consumption of smaller portions than usual for a month or more. So I guess the question there would be, what is meant by some? Is that at least one or all? What is meant by smaller portion? What if the usual portion has always been inadequate? Why use 1 month as the reference period? The other indicators refers to 1 week. So I think these are just some of the challenges that one faces when one tries to come up with a multidimensional poverty index, selecting the dimensions, selecting the indicators, and selecting the deprivation threshold. So, and in addition to selecting the deprivation threshold at the household level, the authors also chose K, which is the second cutoff threshold, to be 0.3. I know that this is the cutoff that has been used by the AF formula, but I'm wondering, how will the poverty profile change if one uses another value? I know that 0.3 was chosen arbitrarily, so what happens if you chose another number? How would the profiles change, and how would the prioritization across areas and across groups change? Now, turning to the policy implications of the study. This is actually very using composite indices for public policy would facilitate overall ranking of, as I mentioned, countries, regions, or sublocations in terms of particular development outcomes using a single number. So you have that single number, and so it's easy to rank not just locations like countries or regions, but even across groups. But I think in terms of a basis for action, more information is required for planning and implementation of appropriate, targeted, and impactful interventions to take into account differential needs across population and communities, given scarce resources and competing needs. So what this implies is that when this data are actually shared with the communities and more importantly, with the decision makers at the local level, the aggregate index needs to be also complemented, or the component indicators also have to be shared with the stakeholders, and this could be used as the basis for the interventions, because a composite index would not easily identify what are the specific gaps being experienced by communities or being experienced by the household. So the component indicators, or the indicators for the different dimensions and also for the different indicators, would be necessary to be able to come up with well-designed and targeted interventions. Also, further details on the implications of adding more or examining a different set of dimensions and indicators to be monitored, and also having additional data sources for generation of indicators and standards for assignment of weights are deemed important to provide better guidance to target stakeholders in the use of the research research results. What I also want to raise at this time is that the need to take note and address the lack of regular source of updated and necessary disaggregated or granular data on the different dimensions of poverty. So while this study has actually shown that it's feasible to do this, but actually it required primary data collection to be able to come up with this. And so you need to put in place a monitoring system that would collect data that can be used to generate this MPI. And that would have to be done on a regular basis so that you can monitor the changes over time. In addition, I think what I would like to emphasize also, particularly for the other countries who have also piloted the CBMS, is that this would be a good example of how the adoption of the CBMS, referred to as Comunidad I in Bolivia context, can complement and enrich other existing tools and frameworks for poverty diagnosis and assessment at lower administrative levels. For purposes of the current ARU study, it would be useful to specify and clarify how primary basic requirements for generating the MPI and other component indicators required by the AF and Mpit framework have been collected using the tools and methodology of CBMS. Because we have heard that 112 indicators are needed to come up with this MPI. So I was wondering how long is the questionnaire for this and how long does it take? So the operational requirements for doing this data collection on a regular basis. Okay, and finally, I think although we have seen we have seen the profiles of the different municipalities as well as subgroups of the population, I think it would be interesting to see how the communities and particularly the local decision makers would appreciate the information that have been collected. I'm very glad to see that the validation activities were undertaken and that the communities actually concurred with the findings of the study. But it would also be very interesting to see the interventions or actions that would be taken by the policymakers in response to the findings of the study. And moving forward to the next slide, I think what we would suggest is that the research study can be replicated to cover additional observations, more households within the communities, as well as with perhaps other municipalities in the region using the same tools and methodology for data collection and analysis. The use of CBMS data for multidimensional poverty analysis can be extended beyond generation of MPI to generate other indicators for reporting of subnational progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. If I have a few more minutes, I would also want to strongly recommend that panel data be generated to examine changes in the different dimensions of poverty and impacts of policies and shocks across time. And if we just go to the next slide, just quickly, I know I just have a few minutes left. The next slide would actually show that in addition to MPI, the data that you have collected can actually be used already to localize the SDGs. And I'm sure UNDP would be very interested in showing how what you have developed so far can be used to localize the SDGs, because the CBMS can already collect or generate data for about 39 SDG indicators. And as has been mentioned, we're just 9 years away from 2030, and yes, we're still grappling with the lack of disaggregated or granular data to be able to ensure that no one is left behind. And finally, in the next, can we just go back to the previous slide? Just wanted to mention that this has been piloted, the CBMS has actually been piloted in other countries as well. And in the case of Latin America, also in Nicaragua, as well as in Argentina. So I'll stop here because some of my other comments are very specific and I can share this with the authors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Celia. Le agradecemos a la doctora Celia Reyes por los valiosos comentarios a la investigación. Pregunto a los autores si desean responder a los comentarios o añadir algo más a su presentación.
Yes, Stephanie, thank you. I will share my camera now. Okay, so thank you, Doctor, for taking the time to read the paper and give us these valuable commentaries. Without doubt, this will serve us to complete and upgrade the paper. Yes, as you mentioned, SDG's first goal is to end poverty in all its forms. And also many of the objectives in the SDG agenda also seek to reduce the vulnerabilities and exposure of poor people to the diverse shocks that these people are usually exposed, you know? So yeah, this is why a multidimensional framework is important in order to see how these persons are comparing to rural and urban areas. And as you mentioned, yes, our foundation moved forward from the first experience a few years ago. And now we use a combination of methods, CBMS to collect the information, MPIT for define our dimensions and indicators, and also the AF method for aggregation. So this shows us that a multidimensional framework can be very flexible and can adapt to a different context. It doesn't matter also if it's a rural or urban context, one can adapt it very easily. And as you mentioned, our foundation extended this experience, and for these particular exercises, utilize the CBMS method to collect the information, to identify the indicators and translate them into questions from the survey. This is something that is especially different from this MPI to other applications in Bolivia or also in the region, because we use a primary information and construct the survey according to the needs of information and indicators we need for our MPI. And also a key point that I would like to mention is that poverty data in Bolivia is still measured either by a monetary lens with information coming from annual household surveys or by unsatisfied basic needs, which uses census data. So still to this day, there is not an official multidimensional poverty measurement. And this experience, of course, will teach us better practices in monitoring the quality of data collected. And these exercises and experiences are also essential to give local authorities from municipalities and communities, in this case in rural contexts, and this gives valuable information so they can implement policies and relieve their populations from the main deprivations they face. So this is a very powerful tool. Also, as you noted, we will include in our review of literature the CBMS indicator, which measures monetary and non-monetary indicator. And well, the main difference from the MPIT, as you mentioned, is that this framework that we use in the paper only focuses on dimensions for rural populations. But it also incorporates dimensions that are always important to measure, like education, health. So the MPIT framework seeks a middle ground. No? It assesses the core dimension of rural poverty by addressing universal human needs and other essential domains relevant to the reduction of rural poverty, like the author of the MPIT said, in a 21st century. And also something that it's worth pointing out is that the survey that we used does not collect monetary modules or questions about the incomes in a labor or non-labor environment. And also it's very important, the slide that you showed, that where there are many frameworks like Foster that has 10 dimensions, the MPIT, which is the more extensive one that has more than 100 indicators, also the CBMS. And I will also add to that list the Coneval method in Mexico that also has a monetary dimension that combines it with social dimensions. And also the CIDA framework from Swedish agency that also has 4 dimensions. The exercise presented here represents an extensive one from the MPITs. We use exactly all the dimensions, subdimensional indicators that the authors of this method propose. So with this first exercise, we seek to replicate the guidelines made by IFAD in order to construct the MPI, because also as we are exploring the Andean region, we wanted to compare the role of each municipality, in which state each municipality is right now. But in order to have a more robust measure, or a measure that adapts better to a specific context, we could take into account the different interviews that we made collecting the information, and also take the information from these validation workshops to adjust a little bit the measurement and compare it to our original one. So yes, that's something we look forward of doing next for our paper. And it's also very important to view what other dimensions and indicators we can add to our MPI, like you mentioned, the access to financial inclusion, that could be one. And this, of course, is a very valid argument, because all the MPIs should be tailored to a specific context. For example, somewhere where violence against women is perceived as a major issue should be considered as a dimension in that MPI, or empowerment or social security dimension. And more rural contexts should have land, climate-related dimensions. And so MPI should be a reflection of what populations perceive is important for them and is more related to poverty in that regions. And yes, we use the household as our unit of analysis. This has some drawbacks because it's not sensitive to the deprivation of intra-household distribution, and thus is unable of displaying substantial, often, for example, gender differentials or other subgroups of populations in deprivation and multidimensional poverty. So yeah, it indirectly treats a household like a black box, because if a household is identified as poor, all the members of the household will be identified as poor too. So that doesn't allow us to see how the difference between the household are behaving. I don't know if Lucila would like to add something to these commentaries.
Yes, but I need the presentation, please, in order to add comments.
Give me 1 minute, please.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, as Sergio stated, the main objective was to monitor poverty in a rural setting. For that reason, we consider the IFADs in part a better approach to this context. So we use the questionnaire for households and villages, and we know that some adjustments are necessary to avoid ambiguities. As in the case of what do we understand as small meals. Maybe we won't be the same that another person understands for small portions. So we agree that the adjustments are necessary in the questionnaire in order to avoid those ambiguities, and to talk about specifically about the poverty threshold, because we know that this cutoff determine who is poor or not, and we know that when we see the figure related to the maximum variance, I don't know, Sergio, if you could put the figure of the poverty threshold. We see that at 33% is the maximum variance, but we took the 30% because Esmeralda municipality have a maximum variance there, but not the other municipalities. So in order to use a common poverty threshold, we made tests, and we did not present it, but the tests were made. And if we can see the last page, please. We made test of robustness, and we can see that there is we can see the complementary CDF poverty dominance and the adjusted headcount ratio dominance curves. And we see that breaks are closer to the 27 to 33%. So for that reason, we chose a middle point, but also we made a Kendall, we use the Kendall-Tau correlations to prove if the poverty threshold was adequate. So in the last, no that one, the last one, yes, we made the correlations between the original MP8 at the cutoff of 30% and the specifications with alternative poverty cutoffs between 25 and 35, and we can see that with this test to evaluate the robustness of the poverty threshold, we calculate correlations with between 25 and 35%, as I stated, and a comparison between two households is robust if household A is poorer than household B, regardless of the specification alternatives threshold. So in this case, the Kendall-Tau estimated coefficient for every single territory show stability, because the correlation is between 0.84 and 1 in the case of Yunguyo del Litoral, which means that at least 84% of the cases of poverty are captured by the indicator when changes of poverty cutoffs were performed. So we chose the 30% as the poverty threshold. And I guess that will respond to the questions related to the poverty threshold.
Muchas gracias, Sergio y Lucila, por su participación. A continuación abriremos el espacio de preguntas abiertas al público. Pido por favor a los participantes que quieran hacer una pregunta en la reunión de Zoom, levanten la mano con el botón que se encuentra en la parte inferior de la ventana de participantes, o también pueden escribirlas en el chat. Recordar también que las personas que nos están viendo por Facebook pueden dejar sus consultas en la parte de comentarios y enseguida serán leídas a los autores. Ahora sí pasamos a la recolección de las preguntas de la reunión de Zoom. Adelante, por favor, quien quiera hacer su pregunta o consulta o comentario. Tenemos una apreciación en el chat de Zoom de Alejandro Bricker, que dice: simplemente quisiera agradecer a Álvaro por la invitación y felicitar a Lucila y Sergio por el trabajo realizado. Si es posible, quisiera poder recibir una copia del trabajo. Best regards to Celia Haspadet. Sí, claro que sí. Muchas gracias por el comentario. Sí se va a poder recibir una copia del trabajo. Me parece que no hay más comentarios en la reunión de Zoom. Vamos a chequear si hay en Facebook. Me parece que no tenemos ninguna consulta en Facebook. Entonces, ahora daremos paso a la presentación de Milenka Figueroa, quien es economista por la Universidad Católica Boliviana, tiene una maestría en Población y Desarrollo Económico por la Universidad de Chile y maestría en Desarrollo Económico por la Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar. Es analista económico en el Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo hace más de 10 años. Ha participado en la elaboración de 3 informes sobre desarrollo humano, es investigadora del Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo y es quien hablará en esta ocasión sobre la relevancia del IPM rural. Adelante, por favor, Milenka.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this session of the Applied Research Workshops, which deals precisely with the measurement of multidimensional poverty in rural environments. And I congratulate Lucila and Sergio for their research presentation. In this regard, I will make a few more brief comments of the experience of using the tool. As you know, as an international measure, we have the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, which is made up of 3 dimensions and 10 indicators. It has few indicators and it has a few dimensions precisely to facilitate comparison between countries. The idea of this measurement is to look beyond poverty measurement by income and complement it with a multidimensional view that also encompasses the life cycle of the people and their rights. In this sense, many countries have built their own MPIs, considering their own reality in order to have a better understanding of poverty and act to reduce it through public policy interventions. The development of this tool in countries such as Colombia, Chile, Panama, and others has taken approximately 1 year, in which we have not only worked on the construction of the MPI, but also on the articulation with a registry of beneficiaries to work on. In our case, as Bolivia, we were also working on the process of having a national MPI that was quite advanced by government institutions, but unfortunately was not completed. But the most important thing is that together we had not worked on the articulation with the registry of beneficiaries or a social protection system. In this sense, it is great achievement to have local measurements of multidimensional poverty, especially in rural areas where there are no measurements of monetary poverty. The advantage of these local measurements are they make it possible to operate on the reality and context of the territory, to know the particularities and needs of the populations, as well as their entire environment. And this way, in the absence of a register of beneficiaries, these local measurements facilitates the articulation with poor households or communities to develop much more focused poverty reduction policy proposals. With respect to the approach used with is the IFID approach, it has definitely helped to shorten phases in the process of obtaining the MPI, such as the definitions of dimensions, indicators, and their thresholds. In fact, the approach has allowed a good adaptability to the context of Bolivian rural Altiplano, and even without leaving the dimension, it could be flexible to other rural ecosystems such as the Valles, Amazonia, and Chaco, considering their particularities and difference, but maintaining comparability in the dimensions. Likewise, it's very important to complement poverty measurement with consensus workshops and validation by the population, especially in rural contexts where quantitative results may in many cases differ from qualitative results, because non-ownerships and non-access to basic service in many poor localities would have been normalized. Finally, it's very important to think about follows after obtaining this important measurement tool and how to transmit its results in order to achieve adequate strategic actions or interventions that translate into a reduction of the different dimensions of poverty. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a Milenka Figueroa por sus palabras. Agradecemos a los asistentes por su participación y también les pedimos por favor que antes que finalice el evento puedan llenar la encuesta que les estamos dejando en el chat de Zoom, ya que de esta forma podemos escuchar sus sugerencias y mejorar la calidad de nuestros talleres. Muchas gracias. A continuación, les cedo la palabra a los autores para que den algunas palabras finales en este taller de investigación aplicada.
Thank you, Stephanie. I would only like to add that maybe we can call it like a central message from this workshop, is that one of the objectives of the designers of a multidimensional poverty is to better capture the overlapping deprivations that people face. And the use of this multidimensional framework that is lately more used in the past years is not because it's better than monetary poverty measures. Because not having money, you have a lack of freedom and autonomy to make some decisions. So not having money is a kind of deprivation. And also people, communities, authorities, and lately more and more recent academic experts also see poverty not only as a monetary deprivation. And also in the literature, we find that these two poverty measurements not always comprise the same populations. Many experiences like in Chile, Dominican Republic found this, that these two measures do not overlap the same populations. So governments should use both measures as a basis to develop policies, because combining both of them gives a deeper view of poverty. And finally, I would like to thank again to Dr. Celia Reyes for her valuable comments, and also to the intervention of Milenka Figueroa. Thank you and good evening to everyone.
Con este último punto damos por finalizado el segundo taller de investigación aplicada de la gestión 2021. Agradecemos la presencia de la doctora Celia Reyes, de Milenka Figueroa, al director de la Fundación ARU, a los autores que presentaron su investigación, al equipo del ISEC y a todos los participantes. Nos despedimos y que tengan buena noche. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Stephanie. Buenas noches a todos. Thank you, Celia, and the CBMS team, Badet, Jazz. Nice to see you.